The next speaker up is Steve Dunn, who is the Director of Technology Strategy for the Guardian News and Media. This is quite an interesting story because the Guardian News and Media is one of the oldest newspapers in the UK, about 190 years old. And this is a great success story because they made in 1999 the switch from traditional print into online media. And today they're getting more than 40 million hits, 40 million visitors per month. Funny enough, when they made the switch in '99, that's exactly when Steven joined them. So I'm glad to have you here to share with us the experience and how they made this wonderful, successful transition. Please, Steve.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, and it's really great to be here. I went to the Leucine Eurocon in Prague last year, and it was a fantastic conference, so it's great for them to invite me back. So yes, as Eric said, I work for Guardian News and Media in the UK. It publishes two national newspapers, The Guardian and The Observer, and our website, guardian.co.uk. And what I'm going to talk about today is transformation that we've been undergoing. Obviously, most of you probably know there's a lot of disruption in the media space. Newspapers are struggling to actually make the transition. And everyone's looking for new revenue streams and is fighting to maintain their audiences in the face of people spending their time with other services online. This is a story from a technology point of view, but it's ultimately about our business model. And I'm going to digress at certain points to talk about how the general thinking of being open as an organization is changing the Guardian's journalism. That's very important to us as an organization. It all comes back to the journalism. So I'm going to talk about journalism, our position on the web, and how we're using technologies like Solr to power our open business model. It's very much a journey. We're finding our way still. I'll try and keep it chronological so it makes sense, but I might jump around if it helps the story. So I'll start by talking about the publishing era. Let's go way back to 1821. The Guardian started its life as a newspaper. We've just had our 190th anniversary. The price was 7p. It was a weekly newspaper. Our sister newspaper, The Observer, actually started earlier. It was in 1791 that started. But recently, distribution for us has changed massively. So this is how we covered the swine flu epidemic story a year or so ago. Printed newspapers, topic pages on the website, live blogs. We've got an API, video, audio, syndication deals, and mobile apps and mobile sites. As Eric said, we had 40 million unique devices each month. And actually, the largest country in terms of where our visitors come from is quite often the US. And in fact, we're actually opening offices with local journalists in a city near you shortly. In New York this summer we're going to launch a US-facing product, so the Guardian's coming to America. One of the reasons why we can do some of the things we can is we're owned by trust. There's no shareholders or private owners, so we can make decisions on a slightly different basis. It's the long-term view that's allowing us to do some of these things, and some of the aims of the trust are, well, just to secure the financial and independence of the editorial independence of the Guardian in perpetuity, but also to promote freedom in the press and liberal journalism globally. And when I say liberal journalism, I'm referring to the British liberal tradition, maybe not quite so much how the phrase is used here in the US, although I think the Guardian might be classified as liberal media in the US sense as well, perhaps. But a commitment to liberal journalism means creating the conditions as I guess our editor-in-chief says, for brave, compassionate, radical, and always independent reporting. And it traces its origins back to 1821, where the person who founded The Guardian said they would zealously enforce the principles of civil and religious liberty and warmly advocate the cause of reform. So that's kind of how we roll, I suppose. It's another way of saying this slide. So a trust was formed in 1936, and that really ensures that we can take longer-term decisions. We don't necessarily have to. We have the ability to invest in our future. So The Guardian first launched news online seriously in '99 after several years of experimentation. We actually had a joint venture with Wired magazine at one point. And from about 2001 we realised that the key to being successful on the web as a publisher was not to be a brilliant website on the web, but actually become a useful part of the web, part of the fabric of the web. And so when we came to re-platform our website, moving from a horrendous proprietary content management system to something we built ourselves, we tried to adhere to what we thought were some web-native architectural principles. So I'll just briefly explain what they are. We had to rebuild because our aging CMS was holding us back. And we relaunched with more audio and video, more color interactives as well, and video, and also community with commenting and profiles. So I guess the first key principle was permanence. Kind of obvious now for anyone who works on the web, but in the early web, many news sites buried their content in archives and changed locations of documents, which meant they couldn't be shared and discussed. And addressability, very important as well, making sure that all the resources on the site were actually about something such that people could point at them and have discussions and actually move the conversation on. And one of my favorite quotes from that era, a guy called Tom Coates, who is actually based in San Francisco. He said, "We live in the age of point at things. If you can't point at something, it can't be discussed, and therefore has less value." And discoverability, very important. Create as many routes to your content as possible. So one of the really important things we did was to tag all of the content. There's no fixed vocabulary, but the tagging is managed by what I would call our operational information architect. We've got a tag manager, and as new tags are created, he is marshalling them, merging them together to try and maintain some kind of consistency. But I guess the really important thing for this is that the site and our information architecture is truly built out of the tags. The tags are not an adjunct, they actually form the structure of the site. So this article about, I don't know, it's about the Prince of Wales eco-town. And it's got, you can see the tags are over there on the right, and it appears automatically on the Ecotowns page. This is our Ecotowns page, not our Ecotowns tag page, and also on the, our carbon emissions page. We create resources by combining the tags together. So we're kind of faceting. The actual site is, the structure of the site is based around faceting. So here's all of our commentary on Google, as it were. Another kind of key principle, just generally being open. By this we mean making it as easy as possible to get hold of the content and being transparent with our information architecture. So, for example, I guess I'd call this the hackable Guardian. So we actually made it so the namespace of the resources on the website reflected the underlying information architecture, so you could sort of combine tags by, you see I've creating a new URL just by, that's literally the URL of the site, guardian.co.uk. If you type that in, you get a new view of the site, and then and that's the page you get. And then if you add RSS onto the end, well, you get the full content out in RSS. So making it as easy as possible for people to just get hold of our content. And this was a very early form of an API. So the results of this change to the website, well, we're quite pleased because prior to the first release of the new system, we were sort of flatlining in terms of growth, and then as we started to release the project, the new look and feel and new information architecture over a period of a couple of years, and we really just hit a new growth curve. Well, as of recently, we're now at 40 million unique users a month. We're quite pleased with that. However, you probably all know that newspapers and the news industry are in trouble, and the growth we saw was really great, but it's not quite going to save us. We need to find a way of growing faster. And when we looked out across the internet, you could see we had 40 million unique users, but as of start of 2009, there's over 1 billion users on the internet. So we're still growing our website in a kind of linear fashion, but the rest of the internet was in big bang mode. This was the era of Facebook blowing up. We thought our universe was great, but actually we're a very small planet, perhaps. So how could we actually somehow grow with the internet rather than just be a nicely designed website? and it's not about growing the site, really. It's about how can we embrace the scale of the internet, all of those, the community of developers and readers and campaigners and activists and businesses that might work with us or could create value for them using our stuff. Well, it was going to take more than just building it on our own, and so this is actually Mike Bracken, who's our Director of Development. He's actually just recently left, and he's now the CTO of the UK government, which he must be very pleased about. It's quite a nice promotion. Anyway, this is what he said in 2008, to try and think about The Guardian as a platform, not just a publisher. Now, we know what a platform is here. I guess everyone is just familiar with the whole platform concept. But what kind of platform could a newspaper produce? Well, the best platforms are open and make it easy for partners and collaborators to climb on board. And we just began looking at what could we do that could help others drive mutual benefit. And we brought in people like Matt McAllister. He actually led the Yahoo Developer Network and helped formulate the open strategies. I like this quote. How I stopped. I'm not actually sure whether, I've just realized it might not actually be a quote from him, but it's just generally how he rolls. How I stopped worrying about my website and learned to love the whole internet. And we've been talking about an API for years, ever since we saw what Amazon did with Amazon Everywhere and Flickr, the way Flickr's built off their API. It's very inspiring, but we hadn't really made any moves in that direction. So we formulated what we call the open strategy, sort of two halves to it. It might seem this is all about The Guardian, but it works both ways. So opening in, we wanted to bring in data and apps from the internet. Firstly, to bring the best of what's out there to our existing audience, because we can't build everything ourselves. But also, we've actually got quite a large audience and quite a large platform. We can perhaps bring an audience to other people's applications and share in what we produce. And the other half, open out, it's probably a bit more straightforward, just distributing our content, ads, and more across the internet. But it also could be used to allow partners to build their own applications using our content and the things that make us popular. So that was a sort of position where we were from a technology point of view, but the story is wider than just the web development team. It actually applies across the organization, and actually, luckily, being a newspaper, we have access to great illustrators. This is Andre Krause's illustration of the traditional walled garden approach to publishing. You've got a group of journalists inside the cathedral, broadcasting to the audience in the bazaar, to use that terminology. I don't know whether some of them seem to be not enjoying being broadcasted to. So that's the kind of traditional model, I guess, for newspaper and a lot of media. In fact, some of our competitors are actually building the walls higher in attempt to retain the revenues to cover the significant costs of production. This is our editor-in-chief, Alan Rusbridger, and obviously we're in a very experimental phase at the moment, but he says that, well, our most interesting experiments are combining what we know with the experience and opinions and expertise of those people who want to participate rather than passively receive. Journalists are finding out that typically they don't know, they are not the expert. They may be the person who's curating the stream around the story, but they're not necessarily the person. Typically, someone reading the story will know more than they do. So I think where journalism's heading at The Guardian, he said the most successful products will be linked, collaborative, participative, transparent, networked and multidisciplinary, and this is the way that we are going. I mean, I think the main thing is that we acknowledge that what we do is part of a global dialogue about the news, and it needs to be more give and take. Currently, news is very much production, consumption, and we don't think that necessarily generates the best product in the end. So, I mean, there are alternative models out there. Here's Rupert Murdoch. His newspapers are taking an aggressive move in what you might say the opposite direction to The Guardian's, the paywall or subscription model. And I think it's too early to say whether the paywall model for news is a successful failure. In fact, I kind of hope it succeeds because the news industry needs to survive, and if there's another option out there that works, then maybe that's how we have to survive. But actually, I don't think it will. And I'll explain why we can't choose that path. Going a little bit further away from technology, I'll just diverge into an example for why a news organisation needs to be open to generate the best journalism. To give an example, the continuing Arab Spring, the series of ongoing democratic revolutions and changes in North Africa. I guess people have been following this story to a certain extent. It's a big news story. The Guardian didn't have really enough people in the area to cover the story in full, so we had to find a different way of working. I mean, even if we did have enough people to cover the story, it was moving so fast, moving from location to location, it was impossible to cover the story well. So we started with what we know. The focus of all our coverage on this sort of news story is a live blog. It's becoming quite a common way for news organizations to cover continually breaking living stories. So you're continually adding new content to an article and as a stream of updates. We also got some help with translation. So we got someone who could speak Arabic from her normal work in The Guardian and she helped translate a few things, and then we got a translation partner to do it as a service, and after a while we had all the important stories running in both Arabic and in English. And saw huge numbers of visitors from Egypt in addition to the expected UK traffic. Now, of course, because we're open to the web, you're going to get more traffic than if you're closed, but that's not the point of this example. I'll continue. I think the real point is the journalistic value you get from being open and the feedback you get. So we invited voices from around the world into our community platform. Comment is free, and we got a lot of depth from Egyptian voices and primary sources who knew more than we did about the issues, and people who were there, people who are educated, and people who are explicitly not British. And we linked out to other sources on Twitter, other bloggers that we found, and started curating lists of interested blogs. And the result, we've got huge participation on the website, thousands of shares on Facebook and comments. But most importantly, and this comes to the crux of it, it was actually people participating in the storytelling. We were sourcing the news directly. So when people were commenting, if they knew what was going on, we presented that in context in the live mainstream along with the rest of our stuff. And so they actually became part of the story as contributors and distributors as well. And it helped really push and pull the story around our coverage. And none of this could have happened if we were behind a paywall, because these people who were in Egypt would not have been able to access and participate as well. Contrast that with the paywall model, the Times of London. It's high quality, but you probably can't read that there. 19 comments on that piece. So there's high quality filtering of what's out there, but very low participation. They were missing the important parts of the story. If you look at the voices they had, you had the regular columnists. They didn't really have a model for embracing other voices. The coverage by necessity had to be very British, which for this story didn't work particularly well. I mean, the model that they've got serves an audience very well, and many people are willing to pay for that, but it's not something it's not where we want to be, in contrast with an open model. I'll just leave this bit with a quote this is Jack Schenker, who was our Egypt correspondent, and he covered the revolution in Tahrir Square. And I mean, he said that the Guardian's live blog in particular, the Guardian was being read on the streets in Tahrir, not just in Cairo, but elsewhere, and that just would never have happened if we'd been closed off. So this is where we feel we have to be. So after a bit of a journalistic digression, I managed to get the word revolution in there as well. So we're back to the open strategy. So that sort of demonstrates that basically the whole organization is reaching forward and trying to see how we can gain by being open. So open out and open in as a platform, this is what we decided to do. And back in 2009, we decided to actually work on it and try and make it real. So we launched what was called the Open Platform, billed as the suite of services enabling partners to build applications with The Guardian. And it was released in beta to start off with. And we started with the open out part, with a content API built off our search engine, delivered the full content of The Guardian, now going back 12 years worth, and a data store, so based on Google Docs. We uploaded spreadsheets and important data into Google Docs, and other meaningful data that we could gather. And also a politics API. Politics is very important to The Guardian. So we've got a very comprehensive database of UK elections and constituencies and voting records going back several years. And we thought, well, why don't we release that and see what people can do? So, I mean, the content API, I guess, is probably the most interesting bit because that's what's being powered by search. It's a REST-based API which presents the information in JSON. And the IDs of each record are actually key to the website information architect. So it's still very much tied back to the original website. You get the full content, you get tags and the fields. I mean, you don't need to read this, it's just a bit of eye candy. And the media. I mean, the idea is that you could rebuild a better Guardian with a developer key, or that's what we're aiming towards. You just get everything. At the end of the first year, we had about 2,000 developers signed up and 200 applications developed with demonstrations of how the open-out and open-in model can work for us. Some of them are just hacks. Some of them actually brought us new revenue, but they were all things that we couldn't have done without this approach. So just a few examples. Here's what Stamen Design, that's a local San Francisco design firm. They built a geocoder app for us. So it went through the API, took the content out, and it was a tool to start geocoding all of our content. Loads of mashups. You can imagine a lot of mashups were done. So The Guardian's gig reviews, music reviews, you would combine those with tweets of people who've actually been to the concert. The concert or the event. I really like this one. This is a kind of a version of Google Fast Flip. Have you ever come across that product? Phil Gifford, who's a developer, he built his own version of The Guardian. It's actually, if you look at it now, guardian.gifford.com, oh, you can see it up there, guardian.gyford.com, and it works very nicely on touchscreen phones as well. And you kind of flip through the stories. I mean, this is the sort of thing that, that's the sort of thing that we'd have loved to have tried doing ourselves, but we haven't got the time to, and now someone's done a bit of UI innovation for us. And it's got our advertising on it as well, so we're revenue sharing as well. Everyone wins. Another example, I guess, of a slightly more traditional syndication deal, Goal Run, the football networking site, wanted to have football news to bulk up its content, and we just made it really easy for them to build a magazine on their site, and it increased the reach of our content, more page impressions, more ad impressions, everybody wins. Moving on, the DataStore we launched. The Guardian's got a history of campaigning for open data to get the government to open its data, and so we thought, well, when you publish a news story, quite often it's based on data. Why don't we just release the data along with a news story? And so we've now got a community of people coming up with visualizations that, that match the data that's driving the news. The Politics API, that powered a large number of new politics apps in the UK in the run-up to the recent elections. Well, actually, the elections were last year now. This is the record for Tom Watson, who we used to call the UK Member of Parliament for the Internet, because he's basically the guy who kind of really gets the web, and he's still an MP, I think. So my favourite app that was built is a guy called Martin Petz, who is a web designer, and he really supports electoral reform. So currently the UK parliamentary system is not proportional. Some people think it should be, and he used our data to kind of measure the power of an individual's vote, because we don't have a proportional voting system, so depending on where you live in the UK, your vote may or may not have a different power depending on the structure of your constituency. And so you could type in your postcode. He used our data to kind of show how powerful your vote was. So, I mean, there were lots of apps built, but one of the things that most people find when they release an API is that the developers in the company actually start really going to town and using it as well. And it's been incredibly useful for our own developers and for the commissioning process as well. So I guess as well as just allowing people to scratch and itch themselves, continuing the dog metaphor, it's been very useful. The explosion of app stores and devices has been very challenging for news organizations, need a high quality presence on all of these platforms. And we've used the Content API to commission or build all of our native apps. So quite often we've found development houses have come to us with an app that they have already built on a new platform using our API and saying, would you like to buy it? And in some cases we have bought it. Sometimes we've taken the source code in-house, and we've built some really cool things ourselves. It's really, I guess we kind of built the open platform just in time to make this easier. So obviously I just showed you previously a whole bunch of JSON and said it was a REST API. Some people don't really understand what that stuff means. So how can we make it even easier to get people on board? Well, how about the web's most popular content management system, WordPress? We built a WordPress plugin so that WordPress users could find and use content directly in the WordPress UI. So you just install the plugin, enter your developer key, and you can start rolling. And how we used that ourselves, back to the dog food, is we built out a blog network. So areas where The Guardian lacked strength in coverage, such as science, we actually sort of tempted who we thought were the best science bloggers and built a network where we're sharing revenue with them, ad revenue, and they publish into our CMS and then power their own blogs using our WordPress plugin. So it works very nicely that way. So that's just kind of an idea of what people have been doing with the open platform. I'll just quickly cover how the business model works, and I'll get on to the actual how it works in terms of technology. So we decided there were 3 tiers of access. You can just use the open platform without a developer key at all. You can just come along and get the headlines and do what you want with that. We don't really care. It's out there on the web. Or you can apply for a key and we'll approve it. Your key is post-approved, so you can get going straight away. You can get the full content with that, but you have to publish an ad and you have to add some tracking code to your site. Or there's a bespoke model where you've talked to us and we're paying you some money, we maybe have commissioned you, or there's some kind of negotiation over the fees. And so what we're trying to aim at is a sort of pyramid of different apps where at the bottom we've just got thousands. We don't care how many people just using the content, and maybe we're going to get a very large number of small cents and pennies from the ad revenue there. Probably 10 to 100 apps that are actually where we've had a conversation with the developer and actually have some kind of deal in place. And then about 10 or so official Guardian branded apps that are actually something where to the user of the site it's just something, it's just part of the Guardian, or the user of the Guardian mobile site or the Guardian app, it's just one of our products. So, I mean, what this means basically is that we've now got a situation where developers can access full content APIs, keys post-approval, and we're doing business on the platform. It's actually a core requirement, rapid scalability, because we don't know who's going to come to the open platform next and start building an app. Reliability, it's got to have the same uptime or better, actually, than our core website. I just want to talk about the open-in side a bit, and then I'll come on to how we actually, how it works. So I talked about open-out, pushing our content out there. The open-in, we built a framework which we called microapps, which is a REST HTTP framework that proxies other people's applications and connects them into our site. So people will write their own applications, host them in the cloud, and we can deploy them into production, well, without a rebuild, essentially. And I guess it means we can take small-scale developers, they can build something cool and say, wouldn't it be great if there was a component on every page on your site that did this? They can do that. They can connect it into our information architecture. We can host it for them. An example of this is actually, I picked one, a search engine that was built, a search of world government data. This is actually powered by Solr. It's running in the cloud. It's plugged into our website using the microapps framework. So if you're into hacking with government data, I suggest you come to our world government data site. Another slightly more leisurely example, here's a nice deal we did with a developer who took our recipe content using the OpenOut API, parsed it for recipes, plugged it into his website, What Could I Cook? And then in return, he gave us an application that we plug back into our website. So we've got a nice, cool recipe search. I don't know what search engine it's using. The great thing is it doesn't matter. We don't need to know. So in terms of bringing this all together commercially, kind of a serious example of how openness helps our bottom line. Typical online publishing business practice is you do a deal with a sponsor, you meet an advertiser, and they want to publish a special supplement in the newspaper, one of these things that falls out of the newspaper when you open it to read it, and maybe a special section on your website. In this case, the English Tourist Board wanted to do a deal with us. And but with the open platform, we were able to do them something much more sophisticated than just an area on our site. And we hooked up with a development house, Lingo B in London. They took data from the Content API, built a new app and plugged it into our site using the microapps framework. That application gathered data. The idea is you could submit your own reviews of interesting things to do in the UK. We plugged that back into our site and also plugged it into the English Tourist Board site. And just this completely, I mean, it's quite simple, but it kind of completely blew away the people who were doing the sponsorship deal. And they, it's just enabling us to land bigger sponsorship deals than we could in the past. So I've just seen the 10-minute thing, so I'm going to move on to the architecture so we've got some time for questions. So going back to the time before we started the open platform, we just had the website. It was a very traditional 3-tier application. We've actually got 2 data centers. And we later added Memcached, as most people end up doing. You notice we're using an Oracle database. We're also using an enterprise search engine, Endeca. This was back in 2005 to 2009. Why did we use a database? Well, there weren't so many alternatives back in 2005, and it's quite easy to recruit DBAs. And I guess at that point, at least, no one got fired for choosing Oracle. So you recall we had some success with scaling, but scaling traffic was great, but we had problems with scaling architecture. This is when we turned on the monitoring on the database. We had a database that was starting to get on fire, I suppose. The spike at the beginning is when we turn the monitoring on. And you can see there's a sort of crude correlation in the growth in database calls per second with the growth in unique users. Now, what we found was that because the site was driven by the tags, we tag all of our content, we found that a lot of the tough queries on the site could be actually solved by doing faceting queries. So we thought, well, we've got something that does that. It's a search engine. So we actually started to run some of the queries that built the site from the search engine. This was actually Endeca Profind at this stage. It was the search engine that we had. And then we came to build the open platform. And you see, as soon as we started turning that on, we kind of stopped the growth curve. I mean, we didn't go back down to 0 requests per second, but at least we kind of put the fire out, as it were, and that really inspired us to look elsewhere in terms of how we were going to store our data, how we were going to run queries. So when we came to the building the open platform and the content API, well, we thought we'll build that using a search engine. In fact, the first iteration was using Endeca, but it was such an old version, we realized we needed to look elsewhere, or at least upgrade, and we were severe limits to scalability and flexibility. So we had a bake-off between competing search engines, and we delved into the toolbox of technologies that were out there. We did a bake-off with Fast, Endeca, and Solr, and looked at a few other things. And we ended up choosing a Leucine Solar. And the main reason why we did was, I guess, we could change the schema without lengthy downtime. But to a certain extent, for me, it was the fact that the developers just loved working with it. And that's just so important when you've got an in-house development team. No strange control processes. The synchronization used rsync rather than some strange engines that ran to run things on. You didn't have to use a UI to configure it. The queries are of similar cost. It scales very horizontally. And it just works in the cloud. And one of the quotes, one of the developers came to me when we were doing the evaluation and said, well, I set up another instance and went off for a coffee and came back. And it had started replicating. And we actually had to get a team of consultants in from some of the other companies to try and help work out how we could make their technology work in the cloud. So the architecture kind of looks a bit like this of the open platform. It's running on EC2. We've got a master index in our colo, which is indexing our database. And it's replicating to the cloud to 2 independent slave indexes, and we can scale that up very rapidly if we want to with a load balancer. The API is running in front of Mashery, who are a kind of API services company. The API itself, if you're interested, is written in Scala, which is part of a slow move from our previous Java and Spring code base to Scala. So our architecture kind of went a bit from looking like this to looking like this. It's gained a flank of Solr application servers. It's a great model for scaling read operations. So we can just expand this again and again, and we don't have to worry anymore about buying a bigger and bigger and more expensive Oracle license. Database is still there at the center, but it's handling a lot less traffic. And as I said, our mobile apps, all of the apps developed by our developer network, they're all running off this cluster of Solr applications. In terms of open-in, how did we do that? Well, I guess the architecture we've got on the left-hand side, a bunch of applications that are running in the cloud and proxied and drawn into our website. They're integrated via HTTP and REST. So we've kind of ended up with the technology that was powering the website shrinking somewhat in terms of importance, and we're actually moving out into the cloud in terms of distributing the applications being written in App Engine or EC2 or wherever the developer wants to, and the data being sourced from the cloud in terms of our cluster of Solr indexes of our content. I mean, there are still some things wrong with that. We've still got our relational database in there. There's still a large amount of code, and you can talk to Graham Tackley, who's here with me, our lead software engineer, forever about the complexity that we've built up in the core of our application. But the great news is that at least most of our new development is based on the clean API and the micro app, so it's not getting any more complex, we hope. What of the future? Well, I guess we can look again into our box of tricks. We haven't really formally started on this yet, but we think that the next, the next stage is to make the API read-write. And we've been looking at other technologies as well, and we think the future is going to be a hybrid of using Leucine Solar and MongoDB. We think we're probably going to end up storing the content in Mongo and using Leucine Solar to power the API, to power the search and the index. So ideally, our long-term aim is to actually get rid of the database entirely and go full NoSQL using a combination of technologies. So I think I will leave it there. If you're interested in what we're doing, do come and talk to me or my colleague Graham Tackley, who's here. Graham is actually going to be at the panel at the end of the conference. We'll pick up some of those conversations about NoSQL and the end of the database. But thank you.